What the Detroit Lions have up front right now is a situation that deserves real attention. On the surface, it looks stable, maybe even strong, but once you slow things down and examine the details, it becomes clear why this could quietly turn into one of the defining storylines of the offseason. The final Pro Football Focus offensive line rankings for the 2025 regular season placed the Lions 12th out of 32 teams, and that ranking is driven almost entirely by the presence of Penei Sewell, who continues to redefine what elite play at right tackle looks like in today's NFL. Sewell didn't just have a good year, he had a historically dominant one. His 95.2 overall PFF grade lead all offensive linemen across the league, regardless of position. His 96.8 run blocking grade wasn't just the best among right tackles, it was the highest run blocking grade by any right tackle over the past 5 years, and it led all offensive linemen this season by a wide margin. When you talk about consistency, dominance, and reliability snap after snap, Sewell allowed pressure on just 3.3% of pass plays, a career best that ranks second among right tackles and fifth among all offensive tackles. This wasn't a flash year. This was the continuation of a trend. Sewell's accolades reflect that reality. He was named first-team All-Pro for the third straight year and earned his fourth consecutive Pro Bowl selection. At this point, it's not exaggeration to say he is the best right tackle in football and arguably one of the top 3 tackles in the entire league. When you combine that level of individual excellence with leadership and durability, it gives the Lions a foundation most teams spend years trying to find. On the other side, veteran left tackle Taylor Decker deserves significant credit for the season he managed to put together under difficult circumstances. Decker battled through a shoulder injury that cost him only 3 games, despite the pain and the extensive rehab required just to be available on game days. In 14 games, he allowed only 3 sacks and 3 quarterback hits, numbers that speak to both his experience and his toughness. As a duo, Decker and Sewell were responsible for just 4 of the 39 sacks Detroit allowed this season, while the total number of sacks allowed ranked 18th in the league and represented an increase from the 33 sacks allowed in 2024. The tackles themselves held up extremely well when both were on the field. That's the good, and it's real. But this is where the conversation with fans has to shift, because the concerns are just as real and far more uncertain. Decker is contemplating retirement after 10 seasons in the NFL, and the injuries have started to force him to think seriously about his quality of life after football. If Decker decides to walk away, the Lions do not currently have a clear replacement on the roster who is ready to step in and handle that role at a high level. The organization hoped that former third-round pick Giovanni Manu, selected in the 2023 NFL Draft, would develop into that solution. So far, that hasn't happened. Manu made 1 start for Decker in Week 5 against Cincinnati and struggled, allowing 2 sacks and 2 pressures, which resulted in a 17.5 pass blocking grade from PFF. To make matters worse, he suffered a knee injury that ended his season shortly after. General Manager Brad Holmes has been candid about where things stand. He acknowledged that Manu has taken steps, but stopped well short of saying the team feels convinced he's ready to be a major contributor. The message was clear: the Lions hope he develops, but hope alone isn't enough. Manu will have to come back healthy, show progress during OTAs, and ultimately win a job. Resources can be put around him, but the responsibility to take that next step rests on his shoulders. All of this makes Sewell's season even more remarkable. In Week 3 against Baltimore, during a 38-30 win, where Detroit rushed for 224 yards at 9 yards per carry, and scored 4 rushing touchdowns, Sewell put together a performance that will be talked about for years. On 37 run-blocking snaps, he earned a 99.3 PFF run-blocking grade, the highest single-game grade by an offensive lineman in PFF history. That's not just elite, that's historic dominance. But even with that kind of individual brilliance, offensive line play is about cohesion, depth, and continuity. And this is where the Lions face real questions moving forward. The depth picture is changing fast. Dan Skipper, a cult hero in Detroit and a key piece of the jumbo packages that helped the Lions score 9 touchdowns this season using an extra offensive lineman, has announced his retirement after 8 NFL seasons, most of them with Detroit. Jamarco Jones, who could have provided veteran depth at tackle, spent the season on injured reserve with an ankle injury and now heads into free agency. This isn't a particularly strong free agent class at tackle, which only adds to the pressure on Detroit's front office to get this right. When you put it all together, the Lions have one of the best offensive line pillars in football in Penei Sewell, a respected and battle-tested veteran in Taylor Decker, who may or may not return, and a series of unanswered questions behind them. This isn't panic territory, but it is decision territory. How do you protect what you have while preparing for what might be coming next? That's the crossroads Detroit is approaching, and it will shape the offense more than most fans might realize right now. Based on everything you've seen from this unit and the uncertainty surrounding Decker's future, how do you feel about the Lions' offensive tackle situation heading into the offseason? If you stay on that line of thinking, the conversation naturally moves from what the Lions have been to what they are trying to protect going forward. Because offensive line success in this league is fragile. It can look solid one year and unravel quickly the next if even one key piece changes. That's why the situation with Taylor Decker hangs over everything like a quiet but massive question mark. His potential retirement isn't just about replacing a player, it's about replacing experience, chemistry, and a stabilizing presence that has allowed Detroit to function without constant help on the edges. When Decker and Penei Sewell were both on the field, the Lions had one of the more dependable tackle pairings in football. That kind of stability is hard to quantify until it's gone. What makes this moment even more delicate is that the Lions are clearly not in a rebuild phase anymore. This is a team with expectations, a team that believes its window is open, and when you're in that position, development timelines matter. You don't always have the luxury of waiting 2 or 3 seasons to see if a young lineman figures it out. Giovanni Manu represents that tension perfectly. The organization invested a 3rd-round pick in him, believing the physical traits and upside could eventually translate into starting caliber play. So far, the results haven't matched the projection. One start isn't enough to define a career, but the performance in that Cincinnati game, followed by a season-ending knee injury, leaves the Lions entering the offseason without clarity. Hope is still there, but certainty is not, and in the NFL, uncertainty at left tackle can bleed into every part of the offense. This is where the internal mindset becomes just as important as any external move. Penei Sewell's comments after the season weren't about individual awards or future contracts. They were about collective improvement and accountability. He talked about calling teammates more often, checking up on them, rebuilding swagger and confidence, and focusing on getting better day by day instead of looking too far ahead. That kind of leadership matters, especially in a room that may be losing familiar voices like Decker and Skipper. Sewell isn't just anchoring the line physically, he's becoming the emotional and cultural anchor as well. Skipper's retirement also deserves more weight than it might get at first glance. He wasn't a star, but he was trusted. He was the kind of player who understood his role, embraced it, and executed it when called upon. The Lions' success in jumbo packages, scoring 9 touchdowns this season with an extra offensive lineman on the field, wasn't accidental. That was about depth, buy-in, and having players who were ready when their number was called. Losing that kind of piece forces you to either find a replacement who understands that niche role or adjust how you operate in those situations. All of this circles back to roster construction and timing. The Lions don't need to overhaul the offensive line. They need to protect its core while making smart, forward-looking decisions. With Sewell at his peak and the interior still functional, the edges are where the pressure points live. If Decker returns, the urgency shifts slightly toward depth and development. If he doesn't, the urgency spikes immediately because you're no longer talking about competition or grooming. You're talking about survival at one of the most important positions on the field. The front office has been clear that no job will be handed out. That philosophy applies across the roster, but it carries extra weight here. Whoever lines up at left tackle next season will have to earn it, whether that's Manu taking a real leap, a veteran stepping in, or a young player pushing his way into the conversation. And that competition will play out under the shadow of a team that expects to win now, not later. This is why the offensive line story isn't just about grades, rankings, or one historic performance. It's about transition. It's about how a team balances elite talent with aging veterans, unproven youth, and shrinking margins for error. The Lions are closer than they've been in a long time, and moments like this often define whether a contender sustains success or takes an unexpected step back. When you really zoom out, this stretch feels like a quiet test of organizational maturity for the Lions. Not a flashy one, not the kind that dominates headlines, but the type that separates teams that stay competitive from teams that look back a year later wondering where things slipped. Offensive line transitions almost never fail loudly at first. They start with small cracks, a little more pressure here, a missed assignment there, a quarterback feeling the rush half a second earlier than before, and for an offense that wants to be efficient, physical, and in control, that half-second matters. What makes this situation so fascinating is that Detroit already knows what elite looks like because they see it every day in Penei Sewell. He has set the standard not just with his play, but with his approach. The way he talks about the offseason, about reconnecting with teammates, about rebuilding confidence and swagger, tells you he understands something important. Dominance in the trenches isn't just about strength and technique, it's about cohesion and intent. That mindset can elevate a unit, but it can't replace experience overnight. That's where the uncertainty still lives. If Taylor Decker ultimately decides that his body has given enough to the game, the Lions won't just be replacing snaps. They'll be replacing a player who understands leverage, timing, and how to survive against elite pass rushers without constant help. That knowledge usually gets passed down through reps and meetings, not magically absorbed. The concern isn't whether Detroit has talented people in the building, it's whether they have someone ready right now to absorb that responsibility without forcing the offense to change how it operates. And that's the key phrase, forcing change. Good teams dictate terms. They don't react. They impose. When your tackle situation becomes unstable, suddenly you're sliding protections more often, keeping tight ends in limiting route concepts, and shrinking the playbook without ever admitting you've done so. The Lions have spent years building toward an offense that can be multiple and aggressive. Protecting that identity is just as important as adding any new weapon. The depth question also can't be ignored. Losing Dan Skipper removes a layer of flexibility that the Lions leaned on more than people realize. Jumbo packages aren't just gimmicks. They're statements. They tell the defense, you know what's coming, and you still can't stop it. Replacing that kind of trust takes time, and it usually takes snaps that only come when the games matter. This is where the front office's philosophy will be tested. Patience versus urgency. Development versus insurance. Betting on internal growth versus acknowledging that sometimes windows demand immediate answers. There's no single right approach, but there is a wrong one. Doing nothing and hoping the problem solves itself. The Lions are too far along for that. What's encouraging is that this doesn't feel like a franchise caught off guard. The language coming from the building suggests awareness. There's honesty about where players are, realism about what still needs to be proven, and an understanding that competition is not optional. That alone puts Detroit in a better position than many teams facing similar questions. As this offseason unfolds, the offensive line may not dominate every conversation, but it will quietly influence all of them. Because no matter how explosive an offense wants to be, it always starts with protection, trust, and continuity up front. If the Lions get this right, it could stabilize the offense for years. If they get it wrong, it could be the kind of issue that only becomes obvious once it's already cost you something. There's also another layer to this that fans don't always talk about, and it's how these offensive line questions ripple into every other decision the Lions make. When you aren't fully settled at tackle, it affects how you evaluate the rest of the roster. It affects how comfortable you feel leaning into certain game plans. It even affects how aggressive you can be in critical moments, because trust up front determines how much freedom an offense really has. The Lions want to be a team that dictates physicality, that finishes games by imposing their will, and that identity starts to crack if the edges aren't secure. That's why the internal development of players like Giovanni Manu still matters, even if expectations have cooled. This isn't about writing anyone off, it's about understanding the Lions don't need Manu to become Penei Sewell, they need him to become reliable, functional, and dependable if his number is called. That's a very different bar, but it's still a difficult